my life was, at least to me, full of challenges that I felt like, okay, immigrant kid coming to this Swedish society, not necessarily being accepted. I wouldn't say bullied, but teased a lot for a period of time. Bullied would be a too strong word, but like teased a lot. But at the same point of time, these challenges shaped me. And in my world, at least to me, these challenges also meant that going through those challenges, I discovered what I was capable of, and I discovered that I could actually accomplish quite a lot of things.
Hi, I'm Jubin, operating partner at Kleiner Perkins, and I'm excited that you're tuning into Grit. The goal of this is not for it to be a highlight reel of how successful my guests are, rather a candid exploration of how hard it is, both personally and professionally, to create, build, and scale world-class organizations. If you're a fan of the show, please subscribe, leave a review, and make sure to follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. Thanks. If it's okay, I think it's worth jumping right into what is, in my mind, the meatiest topic of the afternoon, which is the announcement that you all made waves for last week, which was that you said you threw out ServiceNow and Salesforce. I need to know how much is hype, how much is real. I have a hard time believing that you guys actually threw it out, but it does make it a little more believable considering that you've been guinea pigs for OpenAI, and I mean that in a positive light, for a very long time, early partners with them. You were one of the earliest to get an amazing lift out of the LLMs for your customer support. Came out that there was articles that you got rid of, 70% of your agents and all that. So anyway, there is some kernel of truth that I could see to it, given your history. However, please tell me.
Well, first it was kind of funny because this was not really supposed to be a public announcement of that kind. So I feel a bit bad about it. It was something I mentioned in bypassing at our earnings call. And then somehow that leaked into this website. I think Seeking Alpha is like this news website in the US on like stock stuff. And then it spread from there. And then I've been trying to like somehow correct it, but there's a lot of like speculation around this. But first and foremost, I just want to say that for the record is that like I think these companies and their software can be very good for a lot of other companies, that they can work. And I'm sure that they're all going to aspire for applying AI and these solutions to make their services better. Let's just say that first. For the record, with that said, it is true that we did leave Salesforce about 3 months ago. I think it is now 4 months ago. We are still on Slack though, so we're still a customer officially of Salesforce. We like the Slack product. And then it is also true that we are just, I think this week or something, closing down Workday. That's also true. In general, and like, again, both of these services can, I'm sure, create a lot of value for other companies and stuff. Now, in the Workday, it's a little bit different because part of what they used to offer us has been moved to Deal, which is an employee of the record, but also HRS kind of offering. So it's not like we're entirely, doing that ourselves with AI or anything like that, right? It's, unfortunately, reality is always a bit more boring than the headlines. But part of it has been brought home. And I think that like, to explain a little bit the thinking behind all of this, it is that, unfortunately, I'm going to be a little bit careful with how much details I go into, because we actually find that we believe some of the changes we're doing are very fundamental to where we think the world is going with AI and LLMs and all that. But I can just...
Meaning you think it's a competitive advantage?
I have to admit that I actually think it is. And I think that you can obviously decide which tech stack you build on. And I'm sure you can build great things on Salesforce tech stack, and you can build great things on Workday's tech stack and other companies. But in our case, if I would say anything about this topic, it is that I think that piece of this is just standardization and simplification of your tech stack will make AI more efficient, right? So the more dispersed it is, the less effective applying AI on top of it will be. And the more standardized and simplified it is, the more effective it will be. So that's part of the explanation. And then I would mention one more thing that I think is interesting as a reflection. And that is that when we look at some of the software as a service companies that we used to procure from, depending on their own strategies and their approaches, but some of their documentation, API documentation and description of their own systems are hidden behind logins. And this means that when we go to the ChatGPTs of the world and ask for support and assistance on how to utilize their services in the most effective way, they can't answer because that documentation has been hidden. While if you utilize open source software, you can even have ChatGPT contribute to the open source project in order to get the features or the things that you're looking for. And if at least a company, think about Stripe, for example, has a fantastic API documentation publicly available, at least ChatGPT and other services can guide you towards using them in the most efficient and correct way. So I think that's also like something that my reflection on this was like to encourage businesses to be a little bit more open in regards, and that just accelerates your ability to use those. So I think that's as much as I think I can say about this topic right now. I mean, those are the two most famous solutions that we have stopped using, but there is a tremendous amount of smaller solution that we've also stopped using.
On the CRM side, are you rolling your own using OpenAI?
I think everyone, you included, obviously, will, with some technical skill, will realize that like you're not going to store CRM data in an LLM, right? I mean, you're going to need a database. You're going to need something more than just that, right? So there is going to be a combination of things that you're going to apply in order to make that work.
But you're stitching it together.
Yeah, you could say that.
Meaning, rather than, let's just take the Workday example, you're moving a big portion of that onto Deal and then putting some scaffolding around that.
Well, it's not entirely true, though. Obviously, I mean, Workday is such an extensive software, so you can use it in so many different ways, and different companies use it differently. If you think about it this way, for a global company with employees in over 20 jurisdictions, making sure that you're compliant with payroll and you calculate your taxes correctly is something you want to make sure that you use a proper HRS system for, and that you have a partner that you work with that satisfy and make sure that that happens, especially if you're as Klarna bank, right? And that we don't necessarily see as core to Klarna. We rather work with a supplier that can kind of help us make sure that that happens. And that previously was Workday, is now Deal. But when you then think about other things like performance management, or, there's tons of other things that you can do in Workday, right? There is more stitching, I would say, where we see that there's some other elements of what that software used to do for us that we want to do more of ourselves.
Makes total sense. I can't wait until you can share more about it. But also, isn't it kind of funny? Like, you said something in passing, and now it's like in every news publication.
I am very embarrassed about it because and I also even saw like they were asking like Mark Benioff to like comment on it, and I feel just like so embarrassed about it, right? Like I feel like I am the small country cousin from Sweden. Hello, we're from Sweden. And then, like these guys are supposed to answer to to be fair, like from Salesforce perspective, I don't think the Klarna contract is going to have a, significant impact on the revenue line. But at the same point of time, I obviously understand that people are very curious about what the implications of AI may be to the future of business, right? And it was a shock to me when we did the announcement about customer service agents. Some of those customer service companies dropped 20% of their market cap in a day. That was also a little bit of an embarrassment because that wasn't really what we were trying to convey from a messaging perspective. It was just a shock to see that like people are very curious right now about like what will be the real life business implications of these things as they come into more real life examples and utilization, right?
And the customer service use case, what percentage are you deflecting using OpenAI-ish?
I think also there to be like to provide a little bit more granularity or like a little bit more higher resolution answer to that question, because I've seen a lot like people write about it and they speculate this and that and whatever. And I think that like it is fair to say that if you look at some really big US companies, the level 1 type of support, they would have potentially done more with like IVR, press 1, press 2, phone switches systems, FIQs. I don't think necessarily Klarna was like kick ass in that regards. And we took more level 1 type of support by humans. And as a consequence, obviously, it was slightly easier for us to use AI because level 1 is easier utilizing AI. But we're already almost complete from a level 2 perspective. And there are some experimentation with level 3. That doesn't mean that it's always right or great. But I think also sometimes people forget that, like, unfortunately, humans aren't always right either when they're supposed to answer questions. And especially if those questions are a bit boring and repetitive, there is a risk that people simply don't pay them same amount of attention, right? So there's some downsides in that regards as well. But obviously you want to be very close to make sure that you have the quality. And to be fair, also, I think sometimes people forget about it. Like companies, we have always tried to improve our products. And one of the benefits of improving our products is that people would call us less seldom and tell us that our products doesn't work or that it's not doing what they wanted to do, right? So that there's always been that impact in regards to less errands if you do well. The only difference with this one was that when we applied this technology, the impact to the number of people that interacted with us was much greater than what we've ever seen before. So that's a difference, and we've tried to apply that, and we see that we can apply it to more and more complex use cases.
Right. So you're saying, look, we had this seed of an idea early on when we saw OpenAI, and we wanted to be an early experimenter of what this technology could do to transform different pieces of our business. The first use case that you all decided to go after was the customer service automation.
Yeah, it's not entirely true, actually, if I may interrupt you there a little bit. I think
Please,
yeah, I mean, to us, it was a little bit more like we saw the technology. I saw the technology, others did on Twitter. You try it, you're like blown away. This is amazing. We reach out to Sam Altman. I say, hey, I want to be your favorite guinea pig. I don't think OpenAI necessarily believed that like some bank in Europe, in northern Scandinavia, would be, you know, the most fast moving and etc. But like I'm just speaking for myself, my own, like, again, I always feel like I'm in San Francisco. I'm the cousin from the countryside. But it's also, to me, one of the things that I've learned in my 20 years is that like, I feel that as a leader of a company of this size, you come from a startup where you have to be very cautious about what you spend your time on. And you want to make sure that you spend your time on the things with the highest impact. But then as the company grows, I think there's an over belief in your ability to predict what of your ideas or other ideas in the organization will actually work and what will not work. And obviously, whether an idea works is a combination of the people working on it, the quality of the idea, the number of iterations and speed, etc. But I think as a company grows, you have to think a little bit more like a VC in the sense that, like, let's fund a number of initiatives and see what sticks and what works. And in our case, when this whole AI thing came, we just said, let's make sure we sort out the privacy of data sharing and all the stuff that obviously are concerns for all companies of our size and so forth. But once that was behind us, just like, people inside, please go nuts. Like, try this, apply it, and show us what you're doing with it and how it's working. And then we built things that, like, I'll give you an example. We built a tool. We felt that like employee engagement surveys are really not that interesting. You go out and say, how do you feel on a scale to 1 to 5 and blah, blah. And it's like, you're supposed to do that. It's corporate practices, etc. And it's supposed to, but then you sit and kind of second guess what people meant when they put a 4 in, that field or whatever. And we just said, wouldn't it be cool if we could like have AI interview and do a 30-minute deep interview with all of our employees as a complement to such service? And so we built that and we executed on it. And the team did that amazingly well. And, they obviously had to face tons of issues, like how do you protect the sensitive information and such, and how do you like tons of things. But Klarna is not building survey engines for HR purposes. Like, that's not our core. But we learned so much by doing that we could then apply to other areas. So initially we weren't that obsessed about like, is this core or not? Is it aligned? It was more like, how do we accelerate and encourage everyone to learn to use this and experiment whatever they're passionate about. And then we saw the customer service area was one area where people just had more success and were moving really fast. And so we like doubled down and supported those teams with more resources and help them bring it to production and so forth, right? I think it's sometimes you have to be a little bit like mindful as a large company CEO or, bigger company, running a bigger company, that like you think you're so smart, you're going to predict exactly which one is going to work. I can have a gut feeling that these things are good, but it's better to run a few in parallel and see what sticks.
And the customer service use case, like, this is, I read somewhere you're saving like $40 million plus dollars, and you're improving the CSAT for all of your customers. Like, that's pretty amazing.
Yep. And I think, again, what maybe most interesting stat to me was everyone wants their customer service agents to be focused, but then most people who offer chat support, which is still like I think we do 70% is chat, and then we do, 20-25% phone, a little bit of email still, right? Like, but for the chat support, what ends up happening, and I think everyone has ever had that. Like when you contact a chat support, you're supposed to be instant, but then you write, and then like the agent doesn't really answer immediately, and you're sitting there waiting a little bit frustrated. And unfortunately, the fact is no company wants to admit it, but that agent is doing 4 chats simultaneously. Like, because otherwise sometimes the agent would have to sit and wait because the customer is not, responding immediately. And so that meant that the response time, the average resolution time, because the AI doesn't matter. I mean, AI can sit and wait and it can be instant, so to speak. The response time went from average 12 minutes to 2 minutes, right? And that was the biggest advantage for people using it. That like there's no risk that the agent is busy doing other stuff, right? So people get a good instant response.
And I think the reason why this is really interesting to not just me and people in Silicon Valley, but like generally most people, is that there's so much hype and promise around these LLMs and what's happening in OpenAI world and Anthropic and these others. But the reality is there have been very few red herrings that we have seen to date of full-on automation at scale doing really important business things for highly regulated industries like banks, right? Like when you see that, I think that's where it's eyebrow raising. When you hear about the customer support use case, when you hear about the Workday or the Salesforce, these might not be the actual top 1 or 2 things that Klarna does as a company. However, these are like, if those are 1A, 1B are the systems that support your efforts to do that. And when you're talking about like, hey, we're willing to, as a business, do something very, very different because of what this technology is enabling for us, what at least I think is we're starting to realize the very, very early innings of meaningful value that people like you are almost unwilling to talk about because it's so valuable that you don't want to give away the secrets yet, right?
Well, I want to bring them to market and prove that they're really like delivering value. But like, yeah, no, it's true. I think, to some degree, it's just like what's funny about this is that like our company pivoted a few times, right? We launched a company in 2005. We pivoted around 10. And then in 2015, we decided to pivot again. And in 2015, when we sat down and said, like, where should we go? We did say that, like, okay, at the very like long-term perspective, financial services, retail banking will be basically some kind of digital financial assistant that works on your behalf to minimize your cost for loans and spending and so forth, and save you a lot of time. And that, like, we always talk about like a digital financial assistant that wakes you up in the morning and says, hey, I've analyzed your mortgages. I realized I could save you $10 by doing this. And the only thing you need to do is say yes, right? At that point in time, you won't care as much if it was bank A or bank B. You'll be like, hey, go and do it for me. It sounds awesome. I want to pay less, And so that was the direction in 2015. The funny thing is that obviously at that point in time, it felt very science fiction, but it was still the direction that we decided to pursue. And I always say that, like, to me, it was fun. I was in San Francisco this summer with the kids. And like we used to talk about self-driving cars in 17 and 18, right? And it was the biggest hype ever. And then after that, I've always said that, like, to me, this AI digital financial assistant, it's going to happen. It's going to become real. It's just a question of time. The same applies for self-driving cars. And I always said to people before I tested Waymo this summer with the kids that, like, I'm not sure that my oldest daughter will get a driver's license because she is now turning 11 in 2 weeks. And like that's 7 more years, right? And now when testing Waymo, I was like, she's definitely not going to get a driver's license. She's not going to see a point in it, right? Like she's just and the kids loved it. They were like, "This is the best. Can we use this to school, Dad? Can we use this to school?" Like I just think that there's going to be a hype, and the same applies for AI right now. Like there's a little bit of a hype, obviously, and people like, oh, look at Twitter and it looks like everything works awesome, and then you try it yourself and you're like, my God, this is a disaster, right? Like it couldn't do what I wanted to do, whatever. But there's also like, it just takes a little bit more time before it fully blossoms, right? That's at least what I see and what I believe.
Do you attribute the progress as defined by you seem to be early in doing some of this stuff with OpenAI? Do you attribute that to a willingness to do it? Because in my mind, there's many companies, many of our portfolio companies, some small, but others also pretty big, and let's just say have something to lose, are also very eager to test and try. What do you attribute the unlock to actually making progress? Like when you say telling people run wild using this stuff, what does that actually mean? Because it seems
Since we may have a regulator listening, I just want to say that, like, within the within the banking
no
regulatory
metaphor
requirements.
run wild, meaning
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
hey,
yeah.
don't be afraid to use this,
Yes.
right? But like, how did you really actually encourage that?
I would hope, and I would like to think, I may be wrong about this, and there's always going to be a self-serving bias, but I would like to hope to think that in the last 20 years, Klarna has, from an operating model perspective, tried everything. Like, when Google announced 20% of creative time, we gave every person 20% creative time. And for some odd reason, nothing happened. And so we stopped doing 20% of creative time. And we brought free Coca-Cola and ping pong tables and the Xbox to the office and, Lego in the conference rooms. I think we've tried it all. I think that the key thing that stuck of all that experimentation with trying to find a better way somehow to operate is the Toyota way. A lot of inspiration from Toyota and how they apply themselves. And one of the key aspects of that is this kind of Gemba walks, which basically reflects on like the managers or the high paid senior executives are supposed to walk the factory floor together with the factory workers and look at like what could be the improvements and look at the actual process. And those are some of the key elements that have come into our cultural ways of working. Like, I am not outsourcing AI discovery to our teams. I'm in the trenches with them. I'm out there. I'm talking to them and interacting with them in their Slack team channels. I am supporting them, unlocking access to exciting startups in this area. I'm like coding myself and testing things and providing, bouncing ideas with them. And so are the other leaders of the company. And so, as an example, I'll give you a very concrete example what that could lead to. What I've seen many, many times, despite the fact that I've said internally, like, try this and test this. And then people come and do a demo or they show something. And I'm like, why are you using ChatGPT 3.5? Why are you not using 4? Well, because we thought that when we scale this, the cost is going to be too big or the latency is going to be too slow. And I'm like, guys, that's a later problem. Because the problem is you're going to launch something and the person, let's say you demo it for a CEO of a company, he doesn't know that it's 3.5 running instead of 4. He's going to look at the results and say, this wasn't that impressive. Let's not invest. Or they're going to even try it at the 3.5 because they assume it's too expensive at 4. And then they're going to be like, not so good results. So we shut it down. The amount of times I've been with teams who are like, nope, you're not allowed to use 3.5, use 4. Get it to work. Don't worry about latency and cost at this point in time. We'll worry about that later when it's actually a productive product. It may sound like a small detail, but like being out there discussing with the teams and participating in those conversations and kind of giving them that kind of direction has actually made a huge difference for some of the projects that we run internally and the outcome and the quality of them. So I would like to hope at least that some of the learnings that we've had on how to operate at a company, the culture that we've built, the agility and the ways we work internally is helping us in this regards to accelerate ourselves in this new technology and the way we use it internally. I hope so. I would hope at least that that's the case.
That makes total sense. And when you said you pinged Sam early on and came to the West Coast, did you actually do that or was that metaphoric?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I think it's a bit silly, but like Sam knows this, but like I felt like, okay, this is going to be the busiest man in the world very soon. And so like the likelihood of him taking a meeting with this country cousin from Sweden is going to be somewhat restricted. So I just made up an idea, like, I'm going to San Francisco, man. Like, I don't like, I have no other reason than this meeting. And when I first booked it with Sam, I think I got 3 hours in his calendar. By the time I arrived in San Francisco, it was down to 30 minutes. So I was just like, oh, that kind of indicates that my thesis here was correct, right? But I just wanted to make sure to strike a relationship with OpenAI early on to make sure that, like, they also had us on the map of a good partner to interact with and to be a good partner, right? And I think even such things, right? Like now as we work with new AI companies, be it OpenAI or others, like I don't drag them through procurement. I am saying, hey, I'm being grateful for you being willing to experiment with us early on. Like, take Devin as an example, the AI coder thing, right? Like we said to the team, like we'll obviously need to the NDA. We're a bank, we have some minimum requirements, but like I think again, like large company CEOs risk to misunderstand, and the procurement company kills the partnership with one of these new exciting partners, right? So like it's just again about the details. So yeah, so that with Sam was important to strike that relation and show OpenAI that we could be a partner that actually was learning together with them and exploring. They're still exploring. And I think what was amazing about Sam, by the way, is that like sometimes I feel when coming to Silicon Valley, it can be a little bit of like a introvert culture. It's very much like everything in SF, and everything that's outside SF doesn't really matter. And Sam is the one person I met in Silicon Valley that approached me very differently and was like super curious about what's going on outside the Valley with people using OpenAI and stuff like that. So I was very, very impressed and humbled by his approach.
Sebastian, I think the one thing that strikes me is typically what I see as businesses grow, and certainly yours has grown meaningfully, it's that they play defense, not offense, because they have more to lose. They have more employees. They have a lot more shareholders, investors. They're getting closer to going public, whatever it is, right? In your case, you seem to get more aggressive over time. And maybe I'm making something out of nothing, but this aggression is not just in the form of AI. It is even around things like, I remember, you all raised at a pretty high $50+ billion valuation in the heyday. And then in 22 COVID times, you were, I remember, maybe the first company that slashed their valuation. And you didn't just slash your valuation by 10%, you slashed it by like 80%. And by the way, in hindsight, probably every company wishes they did it sooner, and probably every company wishes that they reset earlier. Again, maybe I'm reading tea leaves that don't exist here, but it seems to me that your being on the front foot has like, I don't know, you keep doing more of it, not less of it.
Well, look, I love the name of your podcast, right? I think grit is such an amazing word. It's so central. And I think us and Klarna, like, I mean, also what people tend to miss, right, is that we may have been on the radar in the US for the last 5 years, but, before that was 15 years of work, and we experimented and we learned and we did mistakes and, etc. So, but at the same point of time, I think when you are the cousin from the countryside, you also have a little bit of extra grit because you want to prove to everyone in the beautiful city of Silicon Valley that you can actually come from elsewhere and do pretty cool stuff. So like there's also a little bit of that going on, that we just want to show people that, look, there's some pretty cool stuff going on here.
Do you feel like the odd man out?
Yeah, man, yeah, especially when I come to San Francisco sometimes. But
why?
Yeah, I do think. I mean, I'm an immigrant kid. I had Polish parents in Sweden. At that point of time, Poland was this like country behind the Iron Curtain that was spewing toxic waste into the Baltic Sea, and like it was not really regarded. So I've always had this a little bit like, I want to show everyone wrong, and we want to show everyone wrong. And I feel that like to some degree when I look at my misfits of colleagues at Klarna, they all share a little bit of that. Like we all want to, there's something to us. We want to show that like you could do something a little bit crazy and different.
I read somewhere that, again, tell me if this is right or wrong, just in the spirit of you doing things different, presentations are banned.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
That is true. Yeah, I think, and even more so, I mean, we went, basically, if you go back to that, right, like in 05 to 10 was just like the first three co-founders, me, Victor, and Nicholas, starting the business, getting it off the ground in Sweden. It was doing really well in Sweden. We were a profitable company, didn't, wasn't loss-making. In 10, we identify a big opportunity, which was to kind of build a global checkout solution, global PSP for global businesses. And we realized there was like these Irish brothers that were onto something as well, called the Collisons. And we realized that there was like this business in Netherlands, which was an amazing business by Peter and others, called Adyen, that also had recognized this opportunity. And we were bigger than both of those two companies at that point of time. And we were like, we're going to go and win that space. We're going to do really well. And the problem was that we failed, right? Like, I mean, I remember like some email in 13 where I'm like really frustrated emailing my engineers and like, hey, Adyen just added 50 payment methods in Asia and we were struggling to integrate one in Germany. It was clear to me that the momentum from a product and business perspective was just not there compared to those two companies. And in 15, my friend Daniel X signed with Adyen and Spotify, which is my neighbor. And I was like, okay, if your neighbor goes with your worst competitor, you just have to look yourself in the face and in the mirror and realize that this is not going to work. We could have easily pretended to be Stripe and Adyen, and we could have exited the company for 2x, but it was just not what we wanted to do. My second co-founder left at that point in time, so it was only me left in 15. And with the current management team, we formulated this new direction that we're on now, this kind of digital financial assistant that we're pursuing. But the big, learning from them was, okay, so what's the conclusion? In 10, we predicted fairly well where the market was going. We just didn't execute on it. So if we're lucky, very lucky, in 15, we're predicting correctly where the market is going. Now the question is, how don't we screw up the execution again, right? What are we going to do differently? And there in 15 to 17, we spent a lot of time just changing our operating models and ways of working. And we got inspired by Amazon at that point in time to a lot, like pre-reads, not doing slide presentations. And that already was a big improvement. But we've also left a lot of that behind us. The 6-pagers, the press releases, Jesus Christ. I mean, I feel so sad against all the Klarna employees that have been wordsmithing press releases of what their product team is going to accomplish in 3 years. And then us sitting in meetings and discussing, no, it's not going to be exactly that in 3 years. You're going to be something like this. It's totally pointless, pointless exercise, which we at that point in time were totally obsessed about. And today, the only thing we care about is demos, Gembas. Show me exactly how your work looks like. Show me what you do on a day-to-day basis. Let's discuss that together. Let's look at how the system works. Let's look at the code of the system together. It's all very, very much working together with the team. So it's changed over the times. But no, presentations are very, very rare internally.
In 15, when your founder left, so you had 2 other co-founders.
Yeah.
One left before then?
Yeah, one
and
left in
15?
12, I think it was, and then the other in 15, yeah.
How close did you come? I mean, I imagine the decisions were sell the company, which would have been probably decent financially for you.
Yes.
2x, not bad. Or shut it down. Or go find a different team, a new set of co-founders, and go do something different.
Yep.
Go work at Spotify, whatever it is. There was a bunch of different. Why did you decide we're going to keep going? And by the way, that's a particularly hard decision because you had all the baggage, both you and the team, of all the stops and starts. You're already 5-6 years in to the squiggly startup journey.
No, for sure. I think that what happened to us, right, is that we got off to a good start in Sweden and became a fairly big company for Swedish standards. You have to remember this is a country of 10 million people, right? But already after about a few years, we were doing 50% of all e-commerce in Sweden was going through Klarna. So that was we were a significant business in this country, right? In 2009, Klarna, Sequoia came in as an investor at a valuation of $100 million and bought a significant piece at 25% at that point in time. So then already a year later, we got the unicorns. We got $1 billion, at which time General Atlantic and DST came in as the lead investors. I think going back today, we as many others were so obsessed about that unicorn thing. I'm not sure that it was probably a little bit early, to be fair, to get that valuation. The thing that was different with Klarna, we got some good advice from our first business angel. So we only got common stock in this business. We've never had pref shares and liquidation preferences on top of our heads. And I am extremely grateful for that over the years. But that has been one of the key things. So we got in at, they got in at $1 billion. And I think that GA and DST, I remember GA in particular, Anton, who was with the company at that point of time, I think, he was listening to me saying hey, there's this business called Adyen that we're going to compete with. And then GA was but Adyen is actually doing better than Klarna. So I think GA over time invested in Adyen and made a fortune. So I'm very happy about that. I hope that I somehow play a role in that. But in 15, 5 years into our stint with GA and DST, they obviously getting to the end of their fund cycle and they're looking for liquidity. And at that point of time, there was talk about listings, but I was very happy and, I had great support from Michael Moritz and representing Sequoia, who was, as I, very committed to the long-term opportunity of the business because the valuation had gone from $1 billion in 10 to $2 billion in 15. So, it was still a good return for DST and GA. But in return, the problem was that GA and DST wanted out And so did my second co-founder, Nicholas, who very nicely had decided that he was going to give all his money away to charity, which is fantastic. The only problem is 25% of my cap table is for sale. And like everyone's obviously asking themselves as investors, like, what's wrong with this business? Which was actually a profitable, good performing business. But everyone's like, why is 25% of it for sale? So it was quite a tricky situation to kind of refresh the cap table, get some new investors on board, and solve that situation. But to me, I was very happy to have Sequoia's support on this and Michael's, that I just felt that the success of Adyen and Stripe was to us, again, just a confirmation that we had a good ability to understand where the industry was going. And I and the team was very keen to show that we had learned from our mistakes between 10 and 15, and now we could execute better.
Totally. That makes total sense. When you say you were grateful about the advice that the angel gave you about the common or not, why? Was it because you could then make decisions that you thought were best for the business, rather than in 15, you bring on all of these fancy VCs from Silicon Valley? It becomes a little awkward a few months after a bunch of them invest to be like, hey, this is a good idea. It's not going to be a great idea.
Yeah. I just have so many friends that are entrepreneurs. And as the downturn came now, in 22 and 23, they're sitting with this massive pressure of lick breath above themselves and different tranches and stuff. And it just makes any conversation about refinancing the company or, doing things so much more difficult, right? So we were a little bit lucky in the sense also because as we got our banking license, it actually became basically impossible for us to raise anything else than common because it wouldn't be treated as common equity from a capital adequacy perspective. So we also had a good argument. We could always say to people I'm sorry, it's only common. It's not going to happen, but I'm happy about it because again, when that downturn came at 6.5, in 2022, I think it would have been so difficult if we would have had all these different structures and stuff. And, now it was just it's equal for everyone, right?
Now it seems obvious, but how hard was that decision at the time to take that?
It wasn't that hard, actually, because, I remember when, and I think it's partially just because I've been doing this for 20 years, right? But I remember when COVID came, one of my shareholders called me and said because remember, for the first few weeks, everyone's like, oh my God, the world is going down the drain. And so at that point in time, one of the investors says to me oh, you have to shut down all your plans, start firing people because it's going to be tough times. And there was actually a few companies that even announced layoffs and stuff in those 2-3 weeks that happened there, right? And I just remember saying that look, I'm not running a small ship anymore. I'm running a big container. I can't shift strategy over a week. So I said, look, we should just hold steady state for a few weeks and see what happens. And then we did. And then it turned out that it was an acceleration for a lot of digital businesses. However, going into 2022, when you see when I saw, we were about to fundraise and we had plans to do the fundraising in Feb, March. And at that point of time, valuations had been high flying in November. But by February, March, we're okay, every freaking week, PayPal drops 5% on the stock market or, one of our competitors. And by the time we're getting, April to May, we're seeing 70, 80% of all of our public peers. It was just very clear to me that this is not a one-off, it's not going to turn around. This is just a shift in mentality. And I think as a captain of a ship, you have to then think about it any small noise you can't react to, but once you decide to shift, then do it properly. Then go all in on that shift. Don't do it small by piece, but just do it, right? And as much as it was emotionally extremely sad and tough to have to take those decisions and part ways with, amazing colleagues and talent and stuff, I think we just decided, let's do this now and make it so that it immediately. And I'm extremely proud of the fact that, it took us 2 years, but we went from loss making of over $100 million per month to profit, right, in that time. And we've at the same point of time, in the last 2 years, we have grown our revenue by 50%, grown our gross profit by 100%, and, improved our operating expenses by 30%, which has taken us from minus $100 million a month to, plus, right? I think that's an amazing achievement by everyone at Klarna to have done that in that period of time.
I've heard you also say that you're not very stressed, This was when things were going haywire. I'm not very stressed. I get more stressed when things are good. Can you explain that?
Well, yeah, it's partially true, but I also say that like I think people should be honest in my position. Like I cry, I get like extremely frustrated or sad about some of the challenges that I face. But there's also another part of me where like I was on a call with kind of CNBC or something, and they're doing an interview with me, and they've always been like fairly like tough questions, but like not overly aggressive in a sense, right? They'd be just like standard journalist kind of questions. But then suddenly this guy comes on the call and he starts like hammering me on live TV. He's like, this is the end. There's not going to be any IPO. You're going bust, and just like, and I'm just sitting there, I was like, oh my God. I was like, no. And I was like, I almost like felt like obviously I can't start laughing on live TV, but like, it was almost like, it almost felt unreal because like, it was like some theater thing. The guy comes in like super aggressive, like, but I think I dealt with the interview fairly well. I tried to answer, I tried to be like balanced, but then I got into the car because I was driving into the office that day. I just put on, Under Pressure by Queen, that song. And I just put it on maximum volume. And I was like, Under Pressure. I was like, that's exactly how it feels, man. Like, and to some degree, I feel like, and I tell that to people sometimes, it's like, it's a little bit like if you want to play Champions League, can you imagine the pressure of playing a Champions League final? Like the audience screaming, you've worked for this with your team. Everything is now at play for 90 minutes. So to some degree, it must be the most stressful and toughest thing that you can do in your career. On the other hand, few football players would say that they wouldn't like to do it. I try to think about those stressful situations in that way. I think to like, look, it's super hard sometimes and sometimes very sad and tough. But like, this is what I signed up for. This is what I signed up for. I want to be challenged. I want to go through these very difficult things. Obviously, I have to realize that I may fail at some point in time, but at least like I can only do my best and I can like keep my head down and just try to do my very best and work hard and try to deal with it. And to some degree, this is what I signed up for. I want to be challenged. I want to learn that. So when things just go well and everything's fun, I remember just before the whole crash of valuation, I was invited to Downing Street and I had like dinner with Boris Johnson. And then I'm like invited to go to some, fancy conference in LA and, Elon Musk is there. And I'm like, it's cool. But I'm thinking to myself, like, is this what life is going to be now? Like, am I just going to run, is this what it's going to be like? And then 6 months later, you're like having that guy on CNBC yelling and like, this is the end of the business. And you're like, okay, no, it was not going to be like that. It was not going to be like that. But to some degree, it's good. It keeps you real, man.
Honest reflection, did you start believing your own hype?
I think maybe because I had kind of gone through a few hype cycles at that point in time, right? So I was like 20, now I'm 20 years next year. But I think it's a mix, right? Like I do, again, if I look back at that time, what I do regret the most is that at some point in time, we started thinking too much like, we're going to have to grow, we have to go after the big opportunity, and that would require more people. And then we just like recruited at like a too high pace. And a lot of, basically everyone else in the community did the same thing at that point in time. But I think that's the one I regret, because obviously as we then had to face a change in the investor sentiment, we had to take some tough decisions, and some of that could have been avoided if we would have been a little bit more careful. So I think that's the thing that I regret more. But like, if you look at like, did I believe our own hype? The key thing is that I would not be working still at Klarna after 20 years if I genuinely didn't see a path towards becoming like a $1 trillion company, or, whatever you want to call it, or like a Google of the world, or like something really big, significant, impactful from that perspective. Like, if I didn't believe that that was still possible, as much as it may, be totally crazy and far out there and whatever, I still personally have to believe that there is such a path in order to feel motivated when I come to work at the morning, in the morning. So as a consequence of that, because I've always had that crazy belief that that is somehow achievable, even though the path may be very tricky and hard, even if valuations were rising at that point in time, to me, it's like we are, as are some other neobanks and so forth, we're tackling an industry that is a $1 trillion market cap industry, retail banking, right? And actually, over a period of time, if you do deliver at the promise of disrupting that industry, those valuation may even look small, right? Like, so I think to some degree, from my perspective, it's like, okay, currently, apparently, investors seem, at that point in time, I was thinking to myself, like, okay, investors seem willing to give us a lot of credit for things that haven't happened yet, but that could happen, right? And I did recognize that, like, that could shift. I also had this a little bit silly thought that, like, oh, the market always crashes in autumn. So when it didn't crash in the autumn of like 21, then I was a little bit like, oh, okay, fine. So be another year, right? Like that was a little bit my, like a little bit silly, right? But I did recognize that, like, you know, when your multiples are growing faster than your revenue, then you obviously should reflect a little bit. And I did reflect, and we did reflect on that. But at the same point of time, you know, everyone else is being super aggressive investing, everyone else is growing fast in number of people, everyone else is raising money at ridiculous valuations from that perspective, right? Like, and so, like, ridiculous but very high valuations. And so, like, so you do get caught into it to some degree. I think it's fair, right? And you do. I think when I look at the really long term, like, I read the book of the founder of Walmart, and I think that, like, when I read it, I kind of reflected, like, let's say that hype would repeat itself again 5-10 years from now, whatever. Let's make something up, assuming AGI doesn't happen and changes the whole world or whatever. But, like, let's say that would happen again. I would not be as caught up in it as I was this time, for sure. Like, I still think I would be even more cautious this time around.
Is your wife also a startup founder?
Yes, she is.
At home, having done it for 20 years, are you like the wise sage, the ups and downs?
The last one she wants advice from is me, I think. But no, I mean, what I love about that is, to your point as well, right? Like, when the company grows, there's a risk of losing touch with what's really important and so forth. And I think Nina has a fantastic ability to keep me grounded, you know, and close to the ground and remember these things. And I think she did throughout all of this. And then obviously her challenges being, you know, 20 people startup, they also were 40 and now they're 20 and had to go through their own tough times and stuff, like, but because it's a different size of a company, it is a good reminder of how things are. But then at the same point of time, I gotta say, like, you know, she used to be a photographer before of wildlife, and then she started this passion of hers a few years ago. And obviously the benefit I have of that is that being a founder or being a CEO of that kind, or being a startup founder, you do get a lot of insights and understandings into, like, how does people work and how does business work. And I mean, it's one thing learning it in school, it's another one learning it by experience. And it makes our dinner conversations very, very fun and interesting to kind of reflect and have those conversations when you share similar experiences, right? It just brings you together in a way.
What do you feel like was the most unexpectedly hard thing in your personal life while building a company like Klarna?
Yeah. You know, I'm going to throw you into something very tough if you ask me that question, because I mean, the biggest difficult thing in my life was that my father committed suicide and had a big issue with alcohol. And that was like the biggest, toughest thing I went through at the same point of time when I was building the business. Sorry to give you, but you asked me the questions, so I got to, you know, give you an honest answer. And I've talked about it a bit in Swedish press. I haven't talked about it as much in English, you know, settings. But, like, yeah, that was obviously very difficult. But I mean, in general, everyone who's had somebody of an addict in your personal, you know, private life will recognize that's a very hard thing to go through, right? That was the toughest thing.
How long ago was it?
No, it's now, 10 years ago. So it's a long time ago.
When that happened, Klarna was early days, right? Like,
yeah, but, you know, we were still at that prime, probably, like, I would guess like 700-800 people, I would assume, if not. Yeah. So it's still like a sizable company, right?
did you tell the team?
At Klarna?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there was like, it's difficult when you have that with a parent, but, you know, he was struggling for many years and was not really himself. And it was just a very difficult situation. I think to some degree, what was sad about it is that when I was growing up, right, we didn't have that much money. And my parents were fighting a lot, and they took a divorce when I was like 8. And then they got back together again, and they split and they get back together again and so forth. So it was like always something of like an unknown whether dad would be home at Christmas or not. That made it very difficult. And I think to some degree, my childish interpretation of the challenge at home was the lack of money. Like I heard the discussion of lack of money and the lack of funds and that being used as it. So I had this dream of mine for a long period of time that would I only be able to create a different financial outcome, then there would be a happy ending, right? Like then, there would be money and then mom and dad would be happy and we would do amazing things together and, etc. Right. And so that was one of the things. And as I then finally, Klarna started making me some money, I got some money out and I went and I gifted my family quite a big amount of money. At that point in time, it was big to me. And, my sister and mom dealt with it fairly well. But my father, unfortunately, only over time used that to feed what I hadn't at the time understood yet was an addiction, right? And so this money that was supposed to create this difference, right? It instead almost like accelerated. It felt like a process. And, I had to learn and understand of like how to deal with that and how to start creating and setting, I'm sorry, I forgot the English term now, but like basically clear borders of like how much I would support.
Precedent.
Yeah, exactly. In relationship, which is like, if you go and I really advise anyone who has those kind of challenges in life, but like if you go and ask somebody for support, like what should I do in such a situation? If you have such a situation in private life, today I understand there's a lot of support that I could have gotten back then on like how to deal with the situation, which I wasn't necessarily well equipped to do. But again, like obviously the big sadness in life is that something that I thought was going to make such a big difference didn't really end up that way. And in the end, to some degree, I felt also that my father was frustrated with what he felt. I didn't see it that way, but I felt, some kind of almost like frustration of his lack of own success as he saw it. Again, not my interpretation, but his, versus what he saw as mine. And that was just such a tricky thing for him because he was like coming from this Polish background of like, you should take care of your children and support them and so forth. And suddenly like he both has this sense of feeling of dependence on me and money from me, while at the same point of time, which obviously made him, frustrated, at the same point of time had this like upbringing of he was supposed to save the family, so to speak. So that just created tremendous conflict within him that was very hard it's difficult.
When I was a kid, my dad was my hero. And over time, he went from, a hero to a friend. And then from a friend to the roles had reversed to the other end of the extreme, similar to what you're describing right now. And eventually just like deteriorated. And that transition, I don't know if for you it was the same way, but like you're just not ready for that. There's no way of articulating that feeling. But at some point, at least in my own world, it made me want control over everything. Because I was like, all right, like these things that were like supposed to be these predetermined outcomes of like stability and all these things, it just didn't materialize. So I was like, all right, well, like I'm going to go exert my own version of stability onto the world. I don't know if you feel that like maybe Klarna is that for you in some way. Maybe it isn't. I don't know. But it resonates what you're saying.
I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's, just remind me when you said that like there was this one time when I said to my dad exactly what you said now, which is like he was a big hero for me when I was a kid. And I know like it was one of the last few memories I have of him like emotionally reacting in a way to me. And like, yeah. And then like the whole thing just took over, right? It just takes over at the end. It just becomes so conflicted. So I can really resonate to what you said.
And on the money thing, I also really resonate. Like the gifts around Christmas from him were, maybe the baseball cards that he got out of a storage auction for, $10, $20, or like one year it was like a deck of cards with a set of instructions around magic tricks, and I still know like one of the magic tricks today. And again, like not having money is one of the worst feelings of a lack of control. Now,
Yeah.
I was lucky to have, and it sounds like you were too, like a roof and food and all of that, but just seeing the feeling,
Mm,
seeing somebody else not having what they would
mm,
prescribe as enough,
mm,
then turns you into overdrive, right? Which is
mm.
sounds like what you're saying of like, well, I'm going to have more than enough. And I wonder for you, was there a point where you then had more than enough? You then gave it back to your family, and then you're just like shit, like it reshattered your worldview again. Like, wait a second, like I thought this was the antidote.
Yeah, I think it's true. And it's now I didn't really directly relate when you said control, but now I understand what you mean. And I think that's very true. To me, some of it was a sense of independence, right? Financially, not being dependent meant that you are in control of yourself and of your life, and that you didn't have that dependence. So I do relate to that a lot. I think that has been partially like I sometimes people internally say like the last thing you should say to Sebastian is you can't do that, like because then then I was like, can't you really? Like so I think that like I have this there was like a funny discussion once when we were like, can a bank really hire Snoop Dogg to work with Snoop Dogg? Does that make sense? Like, well, of course you can. Like, but anyways, I think that or hire, I would say partner. But anyways, the point is that like, yeah, I think that there is some of that. I think, and there's obviously slightly different cultural context as well in regards to success and money in Europe and particularly Sweden than there is in the US. But at the same point, I've been careful when I express myself on these topics because you could say obviously like, yeah, so in the end, money doesn't make you happy. But it's not entirely true either. Money does provide a tremendous amount of freedom. If I'll feel down and I have a bad weekend, I can go and do something really exciting and afford it in a way that not everyone can, right? So, like, it's not entirely true that it's that simple. It does provide you with, to your point, a sense of freedom and lack of somebody controlling you, and you can feel independent in that sense, right? There is that aspect to it. But unfortunately, it's also true that like it doesn't entirely solve all the problems, like in a relationship with a family member. And I feel especially when I listen to like really successful rappers' music, they sometimes rap about this concept of like what happens in context to their family members and how it changes. That's where I sometimes feel like, oh wow, I can really resonate with their lyrics on these topics because there's benefits and amazing things to being better financially off, but there's also unfortunate side consequences, right?
Has the experience shaped an opinionated view of what kind of father you want to be?
Yeah, I mean, partially, obviously, one is that I think, since I myself have that addiction gene, I'm very careful, right? I'm a sober alcoholic. I haven't drank in like over 10 years, right? So I'm very careful in regards to myself. And that obviously is something that you then also worry about in regards to your children. But I think one thing that I have reflected more on in recent years is that like I'm particularly nervous about the fact that my life was, at least to me, full of challenges that I felt like, okay, immigrant kid coming to this Swedish society, not necessarily being accepted. I wouldn't say bullied, but teased a lot for a period of time. Bullied would be a too strong word, but like teased a lot. But at the same point of time, these challenges shaped me. And in my world, at least to me, these challenges also meant that I, going through those challenges, I discovered what I was capable of, and I discovered that I could actually accomplish quite a lot of things. And I started growing in self confidence, and I explored more things, and I learned, and and so forth. So sometimes I'm worried that my kids are just like in this environment where like they go to a great school and everything is tampered with them. It's like, it was funny. I was like at a birthday party of one of my kids, and at that point in time, we don't have like, it's not like our kids at that point in time were in some like super expensive private school, whatever. They're kind of in a good school, but like a normal school, right? And so then one of the parents starts be like, oh, this teacher is not that good, and starts complaining a little bit. I'm just thinking about comparing to the school that I went to. Like, this school is freaking awesome, like. Right. So I'm standing there, I'm listening to these parents who are like typical parents whining. They're all like, ah, la, la, this teacher, that, whatever, But I couldn't hold myself. So at the end, I was like, you know what? Like, I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm a little bit concerned that like this school is too good. And I've actually been thinking about like finding the worst school in Sweden and put my kids in there just so they get a little bit of a challenge for like 1 or 2 years. Cause I think they can actually, it could be good. And the parents just stared at me like, he is nuts. This guy's
Would,
like nuts.
would you actually do that?
Obviously it's such a stretch when it comes to your own kids, but I do worry a lot about like, how do I create enough challenge for them, right?
Grit. Resilience is forged through hard things.
Yes,
Like
right.
you can't just read about it.
Yeah. And I think that like I've talked internally about this a lot, that there is something called the comfort zone, the stretch zone, and the panic zone, right? And the perfect development and acceleration of learning and so forth is exactly when you're in the stretch zone, right? So if you're in comfort zone, you're not really learning anything. You're not being challenged. Nothing happens really, and it's just comfortable. If you're in panic zone, well, obviously you're blocked and you're afraid and you're not receptive anymore. But you want to be in the stretch zone. And the problem also is if you look at a company, is that exact place is going to be different on an individual basis, as well as it's also going to be different depending on where these individuals are in their lives, right? So something that may have been stretch zone 1 month, maybe panic zone 2 months later, if you at the same point of time are going to a divorce or having something difficult. So like these things will vary. But I've been very open about it internally, is that like I want to create an environment, and we want to create an environment where people are stretched. That also means that like we can't just accept that like because one individual say they were in the panic zone, all of us should be in the comfort zone all the time. Like that doesn't make sense. It's a bit like you would sign up for swimming, 40 people, and then one person says, well, actually, I am allergic to water, and I'm asking all of you to not swim. You're all going to stand on the ground and like, do swimming not in the water. That doesn't work either, right? So in an organization, the challenge is that you have to try to create an environment where you are honest and transparent about the fact that we are supposed to be in the stretch zone. And then obviously on an individual basis, you can then try to support people and say, maybe, is this applicable? Is this going to work for you or not? Like, where are you in life? And you can adjust slightly and so forth. But you cannot reset the whole organization either to say just like everyone is going to be at that level, which means comfort zone for everyone all the time, because that's not going to work either. You're not going to be successful as a company. You're not going to achieve. And what the problem is that the people who want to stretch and learn are going to leave, right, eventually. And that's not a great outcome either. So I think that like this concept, and so that's what I think about in my kids as well, is that like it sounds, silly in a way, or maybe, crazy to some parents, but like I want to just figure out like how do I put the kids in the stretch zone? And I can't have them in the comfort zone all the time, because like that's just not going to be good for them.
Can I ask maybe a more fundamental question of why is that so important to you? Like, why is that value matter to you of putting them in a situation where they're stretching in order to create resilience? Like, why does that matter to you with your teams, and why does that matter to you with your kids?
Because my sincere personal experience, as well as what I've seen and observed in others, is that the true happiness and joy that comes out of people recognizing what they were capable of when they didn't fully understand that, or they were afraid to fully explore it. But once they actually start discovering like, shit, I can do this, I am capable of that, like the positive spiral that creates, as opposed to a negative spiral where like, I'm not capable of anything, I feel like everything is scary, everything is like, that just creates like a negative spiral. And the positive spiral of feeling like, wow, I had never thought that I could do these things, to me creates true, again, I'm not saying it's true for everyone, but for a large group of people, it just is an immense joy and some kind of satisfaction that I've seen it creates in those people. And so I wish that for my kids. Like I want them to experience the sense of like, wow, I'm capable of this, so I can do that. And it was difficult, but I learned from it. And now I'm like, it's such an amazing, positive experience. Again, that obviously assumes that you don't push people into panic zone, because then something else might happen. They may break or feel broken or tough and so forth. So it's delicate. It's a delicate balance. But when you are at the right side of that balance, then it is just so tremendously rewarding for those individuals, I think. And then also as a coach, that's the whole purpose of coaching somebody, right? You want to coach and you want to support those people to arrive at that place.
And isn't that the paradox of this whole thing, which is going through shitty things always feels shitty, especially when it's in your first person. From a third person perspective, when you see anybody else going through hard things, you're like, yes, this is going to be good. It's going to be really positive. However, in your own worldview, I've never once had something really bad happen or really shitty, and I'd be like, wow, this is going to be great. I can't wait for the resilience that this is going to create on the other end of it. It's like I go into problem solving mode, and isn't that why it's so important, because everyone's avoiding it. No one actually wants that thing that ultimately is such a positive force for future things.
For sure. Even in the smaller form, we do a offsite with the leadership. I mean, we're 7 people in the management team in the company. And then on an annual basis, we will do some kind of offsite, right? And like on one of our sites, we were in Morocco, and we had the benefit of like staying in a nice hotel. And then in the evening, I challenged the team to like climb one hill, and we went down on the other hill, and we stayed in an extremely basic place. I mean, we were talking like extremely basic. It was like a hut basically at that, right? And like one of my, I'm not going to say who, but one of my managers was like so angry because he was sleeping next to the new guy, our CFO at that point in time, who was like snoring the whole night and he couldn't sleep. And it was cold. Everyone was freezing. It was just like, it was terrible, right? We still talk about it. It's still a fond memory and a laughing opportunity for the team that really bound us, right? Like that experience that we had together. And so like we talk about that more than some like, whatever conference that we went to in some posh hotel somewhere or whatever it might have been, right? So like, I think it's again, like, those are the memory creating events, right? Those are the things that you look back at and like, well, remember that tough time when the company valuation dropped that we had to go through all this. But like, to your point, like it's also the things that you tend to remember and think about.
I think it's a great place for us to leave it. Are you hiring?
Hiring?
Yeah. Are you hiring? Like any key shout outs, not for me, but just like any for the audience, like any.
I have actually, I thought you had heard this. Like I haven't, or we as a company decided in September last year that we've stopped hiring due to AI. So we are shrinking because we have a natural attrition rate of about 20%, which is kind of typical for tech companies. So we have been shrinking. We do hire a little bit of engineers still. We do that. That's true. But in general, we have, shrunk quite a lot. I think we're about 1,000 people now, smaller than when we stopped hiring. So it's.
What were you at the peak of hiring?
I mean, at the very peak in 2022, that we were 7,400 people. But then obviously we had to go through the tough process of the changes and so forth. And then like last year, we were somewhere around 4,500. And now we're about 3,600-700. And we, I slipped a little bit and said that we have a target to become 2,000. And then, media picked up on that a lot. But like, it's not a deadline. There's no deadline to it. And everyone internally knows about that. And I've also committed to all of our employees that the total payroll cost of Klarna will go down, but the cost of employee will go up. So they all know that there's something in it for them in that transition that we're going through. So
it's a whole new way of thinking about headcount. I
think so. And I think internally, like, some people pinged me, some founders after that was shared in news that like, oh my God, Sebastian said they're going to be 2,000. What's happening on the inside? Are people like, what's the reaction? But the truth is I've been telling them this, like we've been transparent about this for over a year. They all know, like, this is what we're doing. We're not laying anyone off. It's natural. People leave anyways. And then people, and I'm not saying like, I'm sure there's somebody who has felt nervous at it for some purpose or whatever. Unfortunately, again, when you have many thousands of employees, somebody will feel nervous about such a message. But I think overall, it's a fair and transparent and honest message to an organization. And I think people have really reacted to it well. And they also now seen, because in the latest salary review, we did make sure that people noticed that we were committed to that idea.
I really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Same.
That's it. Thanks for tuning in. Feel free to come back every Monday morning to listen to a new guest, or go back into the archives when we've done more than 100 episodes. This podcast is a Kleiner Perkins production, and the episode was edited by Eric Johnson from Lightning Pod. Thank you all.